All right, today we're going to dive into the political economy of monopoly. We'll be using the work of economist Fritz Machlup as our guide to really unpack how competition, big business, and even government policy are pulling the strings on the markets we all interact with every single day.
You know that feeling, right? You look at your options for an internet provider or maybe an airline, and it feels like your choices aren't really choices at all. That exact feeling, that sense of a limited marketplace, is actually the perfect way to start our conversation about monopoly. So, to really wrap our heads around what a monopoly is, we first have to understand what it isn't. Let's kick things off by looking at the economic ideal, the theoretical benchmark that all real-world markets are measured against. And that's something called pure competition.
Now, the source material we're looking at gets really specific here. Pure competition isn't just about having a bunch of sellers. It's a situation where any single seller is completely powerless. I mean, imagine your product is exactly the same as thousands of others. You have zero influence on the price. In this world, you are a price taker, not a price maker.
Okay, that definition sounds pretty academic, doesn't it? So what would it actually feel like to be a business owner in a world of pure competition?
Well, for starters, brand loyalty just doesn't exist. If you dare to charge even 1 cent more than your competitors, you sell absolutely nothing, zero. But on the flip side, you can sell as much as you can possibly produce at the going market price. And if you're doing well, anyone can just jump into the market and start competing with you, no problem. Now, of course, a world this perfect doesn't really exist, but it's a super important yardstick that economists use to measure how efficient our actual economy is.
Okay, so let's get back to reality. The real world almost never looks like that perfect model. Instead, what we see is a whole spectrum of market power. And as our source argues, monopoly isn't just one single thing. It shows up in a whole bunch of different shapes and sizes.
So we need to broaden our definition here. A monopoly isn't just a single giant company cornering a market. Nope. It's any situation where a seller has some degree of control over their price, all because buyers just don't have a ton of perfect alternatives. This control can be a little bit, or it can be total dominance. It's a spectrum.
So how does a market get this way? The source lays out a pretty common path. It can start really subtly, with collusion, a kind of quiet, informal agreement between companies not to step on each other's toes with pricing. Then that might evolve into price leadership, where one big player sets the price and everybody else just kind of falls in line. And the final step? Often it's a merger, where companies combine to lock in that market power for good.
Now, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, isn't the government supposed to prevent all this? And that's where this story gets really, really interesting. Because while we often see the government as the cure for monopoly, this analysis argues it can also be one of the main causes.
I mean, officially, the solution is supposed to be antitrust laws. Things like the Sherman Act, which were literally created to break up monopolies and stop businesses from working together to crush competition.
But how well did those laws actually work? Well, Machtlup's take on it is pretty blunt. Looking back at the history of trying to break up these big trusts, he concludes it was largely ineffective. His words, a dismal failure.
So this leads to a really provocative question. If the cure didn't work, could it be that the doctor, in this case the government, was actually part of the problem? According to this analysis, the answer is a resounding yes. In fact, government policies are often the biggest source of monopoly power out there.
How? Through what the source calls public barriers to entry. And when you start looking, you see them everywhere. A patent literally gives an inventor a temporary legal monopoly. Tariffs protect companies at home from competitors overseas. Licensing laws can limit how many plumbers or doctors can operate in a city. And a government franchise can give one single company the exclusive right to provide a service. In every single one of these cases, it's the government itself that's putting the brakes on competition. And that brings us to our final section, which is probably the most controversial part of this whole analysis, the labor market. Now, it's really important to stress here that we are simply explaining the arguments as they're laid out in the source, not taking a side. So, the central question that Machlup poses is this. If a monopoly is defined by its control over supply and price, can a labor union, which organizes workers to bargain for wages together, be looked at through that very same monopolistic lens? The source lays out two very different ways to look at this. On one hand, you have the traditional argument. Unions are essential to level the playing field between individual workers and huge companies, especially if employers are trying to keep wages low. But then there's the contrasting monopoly analysis. This view argues that a union's core function is to control the supply of labor by getting workers to agree not to compete with each other,
so they can negotiate for wages that are higher than what a purely competitive market would set. So when you put it all together, what's the big takeaway? It's this constant, ongoing tug of war. On one side, you've got this economic ideal of pure, frictionless competition. And on the other side, you have the political reality where businesses, labor, and even the government itself are often working to concentrate power and limit that very competition. And that really leaves us with one last big question to think about. We always talk about the cost of monopoly, higher prices, fewer choices. But if concentrated power is the norm and that pure competition we talked about is just a fragile ideal, maybe the real question we should be asking is this: what's the true price we'd have to pay to get real competition back?